As Anea said, I run the Latin American program for the Fund for American Studies, and what we do is every January we bring students from all over Latin America to come to Santiago, Chile to learn about free market capitalism, how the market works, and the political philosophy behind that theory. And the reason we chose Chile, of course, is because it's been called the oasis of progress in Latin America, whereas you have basket cases like Argentina and Venezuela. Chile, even after center-left and center-right governments, has remained a steadfast, has kept steadfast growth, has been politically stable for the last 25 years. So that's why we do it. And the reason for that is Milton Friedman, the Chicago boys in the Chicago school. A little bit of background. Prior to the 1970s, when all this took place in Chile, Friedman had published Capitalism and Freedom. We've seen Free to Choose, but the other book that, the first one that I actually read was Capitalism and Freedom. Published in 1962, it was based on a series of lectures that he had done in 1956. And the book got very little coverage. It was reviewed by almost nobody. It was only, it argued for limited government, legal and monetary system, maximum freedom, as the two speakers prior to me mentioned, and individual responsibility. And when it came out, it got, New York Times, of course, did not review it. Nobody else did. Only the American Economic Review, it was an industry journal, made a review. But the book sold 600,000 copies, which was an amazing feat for what was considered just an economics book. The gist of the book was the size of government. It said that the best government was smaller government. Government spending at that time was 20% state, local, and national of GDP. Until the time Reagan was elected in 1980, it had doubled to 40%. When Friedman's time in Chile, let me give you a little bit of background. In 1970, Salvador Allende was elected in Chile by less than a plebiscite, and he had to negotiate with the parties that were in power to be able to take office because he had not gotten a sufficient number of votes, and they made him sign a declaration of intent is the best way you can call it in English, but it laid out steps that you will not do this and you will not do that, and we'll agree to let you become president. And for the day he got in office, he scoffed at this, and he made a statement to a newspaper that that was just a formality. I just signed it and take my position. And he immediately began undermining the Constitution of Chile and immediately started installing a socialist government. And this lit up Latin America. Fidel Castro went to give one speech and ended up spending 6 months there traveling the country and giving speeches about how wonderful Allende was and how wonderful a project this was going to be. And it would be the shining jewel of Latin America and the world in an actual, the first elected socialist government. In 1973, Augusto Pinochet in a coup took over the country, and the myth is you get a lot of feedback these days that Pinochet was a right-wing dictator. When he came into office, he was neither left-wing nor right-wing, had no political experience, and had no penchant one way or the other. He had actually appointed the Air Force in charge of labor policy. The Marine Corps was put in charge of agricultural policy. And so 3 years later, the economy was exactly like it was under Salvador Allende. So one of his generals happened to hear some of the Chicago boys speaking on a radio station in Santiago, and he had kind of heard about some of this free market economics, so he went to the general and said, hey, what about meeting with some of these guys? They might have some ideas that could help the economy. So he took a meeting, and they convinced him to meet with Milton Friedman, who flew down in 1975 and agreed to a 45-minute meeting. Met with Pinochet and said, okay, I'll put together a brief document for you and send it down here to tell you about how you can rescue the economy. And because of that, Friedman ever since then has been pilloried by his opponents having been an ally to the dictatorship and an accomplice in evil. But let me give you a little bit of statistics on that took place from that time in Chile to now. He agreed in 1975 to offer advice on how to pull the economy out of the slump it had gone into after Salvador Allende. He met for 45 minutes and agreed to offer a brief economic plan, and for his trouble, he spent the rest of his life being defamed as an accomplice to a dictator. A year later, at his Nobel Prize acceptance ceremony, he was met by protesters and hecklers, and he was all typically bemused by these protesters. What he said was, I gave the exact same advice to communist dictators and got no pushback from the left. And even before the 1973 coup, several of the Chicago boys had offered these a set of policy proposals which amounted to basically an off-the-shelf recipe for economic liberalization. These included sharp reductions to government spending and the monetary supply of the privatization of state-owned companies, and the elimination of obstacles to free enterprise and foreign investment. Pinochet had not been either right-wing or left-wing, but had, like I said, had put commanders in it divided up the economy into what he assumed were the proper categorizations under his generals. But the economy continued to slump, and a military officer set him up with the Chicago boards. When Allende was overthrown by Pinochet in 1973, Chile was an economic basket case. Inflation topped out at 1,000%. Foreign currency reserves were totally depleted, and per capita GDP was roughly that of Peru and well below Argentina's. By 1990, the year Pinochet ceded power, per capita GDP had risen by 40%, even as Peru and Argentina stagnated. Since then, Chileans have become South America's richest people. They have the continent's lowest level of corruption, the lowest mortality rate, and the lowest number of people living below the poverty line. Chile's pension reforms have been imitated all across the continent and indeed around the world. Bolivia, El Salvador, and Mexico copied the Chilean scheme to the letter. Peru and Colombia introduced private pensions as an alternative to the state system, and even Kazakhstan has followed the Chilean example. Chile's historical capital GDP growth from 1810 to 1983 was less than 1%. This was boosted to 4.3% per capita yearly after this plan was implemented, and it was sustained for 20 year even with center-left and center-right governments. As the Chilean economist Alvaro Donoso has calculated, this means that our grandchildren will be 8 times wealthier than we are today. I want to give you some very good background on what the economy was like when Pinochet took over and what had been taking place. What does that look like right there? To me, it looks like the Star Trek bridge, right? Captain Kirk particularly said. This was called the Cybersign System, and there was a British guy that was a little ahead of his time, but he was supposedly a scientific socialist, and he had come up with this system that he wanted to find any country that would allow him to implement that would allow scientific socialism. This was in the 1960s, 70s, and early 80s. This was a big, this was going to be savior socialism. And what they did, they had the government before Allende had bought some telex machines. It was just an early relay system for telephone lines, and these things that they had not, the bureaucracy had not put them out into their proper places yet. So Stanford Beer came in and set these things up. They put telex systems. Chile, as you know, is a long, thin country. So he set these things up all down the country in factories and set up a control room in Santiago. And what they would do is sit there and send and receive data on what the production was of that day and things like that. And this was supposed to save the country and show how wonderful socialism could work with new technology. And when Pinochet took over, they actually destroyed this. So this is a replica that they built to actually show this. That's that you can go see in the Moneda, the Capitol building. This right here is the Yagan. Has anybody ever heard of this? This is going to be the people's car. It's a project of Allende's that he couldn't wait to show everybody. They brought this. It was based on a Citroen model that was built back then, but in Arica, up in the north part of Chile. These things were built by hand, no assembly process. They didn't want to do any of these capitalist processes, so they built them by hand, so no two were alike. They put them together, hammer out the metal, and throw them together. These things would cost, you wanted them under $1,000, so the people could afford them. And of course, about half of them worked at all, and you had to, just like the, what's the name of the car I'm trying to think of? The Trabant. You had to put oil and gas in together and shake it to make it mix, and then so it would run. But now these things are collector's items because they're so rare and there's so few of them made, and they're so cockamamie built that people now you can find them being rebuilt in the United States because they were such a novelty. But this is going to be the people's car and Allende's project which never got off the ground. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Keynes, who was basically the nemesis of Mises, Hayek, and Milton Friedman. And in the last few years that we've seen a kind of a renaissance of Keynesianism, and I thought it would be proper to explain a little bit of this, how it fits into Milton Friedman's world in Chile even. But Keynes was a British economist whose ideas were a central influence on modern macroeconomics in theory and in practice. He had advocated interventions in government, or interventionist government policy, by which governments would use fiscal and monetary measures to mitigate the adverse effects, so to speak, of business cycles. He was going to smooth the vicissitudes of the market, so to speak. And this photo right here is what best, and this has actually been said. This is not just a right-wing economist scoffing at him and making fun. He had, yes, you could actually fly a helicopter over the population and dump money, and that would actually stimulate the economy. And my other favorite that's actually been advocated as well is you hire government workers to go dig holes, hire some other ones to go back and fill them up. And what's James O'Keefe, the great videographer that goes and does these great videos, has recently just gone into a union and actually proposed that exact proposal to a labor union, and they were saying, yeah, if we have pull in the government, we can get that done for you. And this is my favorite way to sum up Keynesianism versus free market capitalism. And this has been attributed to Milton Friedman before. I've not verified this, but Friedman was asked to go to China in the 1980s and to give talks there on how they could, liberalize their economy. And of course, the communists and the hardliners there were protesting and didn't want him to come. But he was treated like a rock star by a lot of the Chinese when he got there, and toured around the country and would give lectures. And this is the anecdote that I've heard, is that he would go and, some government minder is taking him around the country, and there was a dam being built, and there was about 60 men out there with shovels, throwing dirt and building the thing. And he asked the guy, why do you have so many men out there with shovels? You could pull a backhoe out here and build the thing in an afternoon. He said, no, we'd lose all those jobs if we did that. He said, oh, okay, I didn't realize I thought you were trying to build a dam. I didn't know you were trying to just create jobs. If that's the objective here, why don't you take away their shovels and give them spoons? That's the funniest thing to me. My delivery man is not as good. To me, it's classic. And that's it. I think I'm running out now. Do Q&A now?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much.